Well, I think one of the things that has come through very clearly from the discussions over the past 2 days is that we are now in an environment in which the combination of new data collection technologies and new ways of harnessing data that are collected for other purposes, combined with new ideas around business models and ways of exploiting these data to create value, has both created a range of new opportunities and a range of new ways in which travellers can benefit, but also expose some issues around privacy and around the treatment of these data so as to ensure that the interests of travellers are fully protected and guaranteed at the same time as they enjoy the benefits of these new services. One of the issues that I think has been very clearly brought to the fore in the discussions over the past 2 days is the capacity of new data sources when they are combined with one another to be disclosive, to inform on aspects of individuals' identity and behavior which independently none of those data sources are able to disclose. But when brought together, the disclosure occurs. And I think that raises new challenges both for the providers of data, in some cases public, in some cases private, and also more particularly for the providers of the services that exploit these data and deliver the benefit to travellers. And what we need, I think, is a way of better understanding the nature of the risks to privacy that this capacity to combine and assimilate together different data sources create. And once we have that better understanding of the risks, then we will be able to create the tools and methodologies that enable us to mitigate those risks. I think we're going to have to accept that there is never going to be a situation in which we can avoid completely the risk of unforeseen and potentially damaging disclosure. But what I think we can do is find ways of managing down those risks to levels that we and the travelling public will find acceptable. Indeed, I think there are risks to others, including the data providers, and potentially also to the system as a whole. For example, for data providers, were their data to be made available openly, take, for example, a freight operator or a public transport provider, the ability of potential competitors to understand the patterns of vehicle utilization or the patterns of demand that are incident on these systems could be commercially very valuable for that competitor and thus damaging for an incumbent. So means need to be found whereby the benefits of making these data open in terms of the ability to generate new services that deliver value to travellers and others is balanced against the need to protect the interests, commercial and otherwise, of the entities that are providing the service. And that also goes at the level, I think, of the system as a whole. Transport systems are a critical infrastructure, and they are therefore both vulnerable to accidental hazard and harm and peril as a result of accidents and interventions of various types. They are also, from time to time, the targets for malicious threat. And both those accidental perils and the malicious threat are magnified when information is available at a highly granular spatial and temporal level regarding the patterns of utilization on these systems. So I think that that's another dimension of risk or peril that needs to be taken into account when we make judgments about how and in what way data are made open and accessible to those who wish to provide new services with them. Well, I think one of the things that's happened over the past decade or so is that we've seen a significant transition in the way in which transport-related data are collected, from an environment in which the data were principally collected by the public sector or agencies operating directly on behalf of the public sector, to a situation in which many of the data sources now that these operations now depend on are collected by the private sector and are then repurposed for other uses into public sector agencies. And I think that creates both opportunities for the public sector and also new forms of challenge that it needs to address. In terms of opportunities, one of the clear and most evident of those opportunities is to replace expensive and aging infrastructure-based sensing technologies, loop detectors, ANPR cameras and the like, by new forms of vehicle and person-centric tracking and trace technologies that obviate the need for continual maintenance and repair of these aging technologies. And that creates an immediate economic benefit. But it also raises challenges. It raises challenges in terms of how these new data sources are integrated into existing forms of operational control and management, and indeed more broadly into planning. And it also creates challenges around how the business relationships that underpin the public sector's access to these data, business relationships with private sector providers, business relationships with other service providers called upon by the public sector who use these data, how those relationships change over time. In a way, the public sector exchanges a dependence on infrastructure for a dependence on service. And with that transition, there arises a need to understand the nature of those service relationships much more clearly than has been so in the past. I think one of the things we ended our discussions with today in plenary was the challenge of what recommendations do we make to ministers. We spent a day and a half talking about the problems in the world as we see it, but what should we ultimately recommend to ministers? And if I was asked that question personally, I think I'd highlight 2 points. The first point is, minister, don't try and pick winners. You're no good at it. But I'd also say, minister, be willing to experiment. Be willing to allow those who potentially have good or world-beating ideas an opportunity to show what they can do. And it's very reassuring and comforting, I think, that the meeting today disclosed that in a number of the countries represented around the table, there seems to be a willingness on the part of government to enable, facilitate and underpin that sort of experimentation, both at the level of research and development and at the level of pre-competitive tender processes. And I welcome that.